Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a topic that's close to your heart as mental health nurses, and it's a big one.
It certainly is.
We're talking about psychological disorders from every angle.
You've provided a mountain of resources, textbooks, research articles, clinical observations. Wow.
Yeah, it's a lot. But lucky for us, we've got an expert here to help us sift through it all and extract those key insights to make sure you're really well equipped to care for your patients.
I'm happy to help sort through it all.
Some of this stuff is really mind-blowing. We're going to uncover why part of your brain is nicknamed the second brain. I know, intriguing, right?
Definitely.
And we'll discover what the case of a man named H.M. can teach us about how memory works. Well, or how it doesn't work in his case.
It's a fascinating story.
Get ready to decode the brain and how it all connects to mental health. So where do we even begin with all this?
I think a good starting point is, as always, neuroscience. Got to speak the language of the brain, right?
Okay, so back to the basics. Kind of like a neuroscience 101 for mental health nurses.
Exactly. We're laying the foundation.
Okay, so let's start with the brain itself. The sources mentioned the telencephalon, diencephalon, brainstem, and cerebellum. Those are some pretty intimidating words.
They do sound a bit like something out of an anatomy textbook.
Right. Can we break
Uh,
those down a bit, make them a little less scary?
Absolutely. Think of it this way, like different departments in a hospital, each with its own specialized team and functions.
Okay, I like that analogy.
So the telencephalon, for example, that's where you'll find the cerebral cortex.
The cerebral cortex, that's the outer layer of the brain, right?
Exactly. And it's basically the command center. It's where higher level thinking happens, decision making, language, all that good stuff.
So if a patient is having trouble with problem solving or expressing themselves, the telencephalon might be involved.
It's certainly a possibility.
Interesting. And what about the diencephalon?
That's kind of like the hospital's reception and communication center. It houses the thalamus, which relays sensory information, and the hypothalamus, which controls vital functions like sleep, hormone release, and even body temperature.
Okay, so if someone's having sleep disturbances or hormonal issues, that's pointing toward the diencephalon.
It could be.
And then there's the brainstem,
The brainstem is essential. Think of it as the hospital's life support system, keeping the heart pumping, the lungs breathing, all the basic functions running smoothly.
so pretty critical stuff.
Absolutely.
And finally, the cerebellum. What's its role in all this?
The cerebellum, that's like the physical therapist. It helps with balance, coordination, smooth movements.
Okay, so if you've got a patient struggling with motor skills, you might be thinking about the cerebellum.
Exactly.
This hospital analogy is really helpful. It's making those brain regions a lot less intimidating. Now, let's zoom in a little further. The sources talk about specific areas within these regions, like the hippocampus.
Ah, yes, the hippocampus, the brain's memory center.
Right. And to illustrate its importance, there's this fascinating case of a man named Henry Molaison, or patient HM.
HM, a classic case study in neuroscience.
I remember learning about him in nursing school. After a surgery for epilepsy, he couldn't form new memories, right?
That's right. And this case was so important because it helped us understand that the hippocampus plays a critical role in forming new memories.
But not in retrieving old memories or learning new skills.
Exactly. HM could still access memories from before his surgery, and he could learn new motor skills, like riding a bike, but he couldn't remember learning them.
So for mental health nurses, understanding the hippocampus and its role in memory is crucial, especially when working with patients who have memory impairments.
Absolutely.
Okay, next up, the amygdala. This is all about emotion, right?
Think of it as the hospital security system always on alert for danger.
The amygdala is particularly sensitive to fear, right? So
Oh.
someone with an anxiety disorder might have an overactive amygdala, even when there's no real threat.
Exactly.
And then we have the prefrontal cortex,
The prefrontal cortex, that's the wise, experienced chief of staff, making decisions, planning, keeping those impulses in check.
so problems with impulse control, difficulty making decisions, those could be linked to the prefrontal cortex.
It could be.
This is all starting to come together.
Yeah.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the building blocks of the brain neurons and glia.
Right. The cellular level.
But remind me again, what exactly do those do?
So neurons, think of them as the communication network. They send messages throughout the brain using electrical and chemical signals.
And glia are like the support staff.
Yeah, they were once thought to just provide structure and support, but now we know they do so much more.
They release those gliotransmitters, right?
Yes, like a secret communication system of their own. And they can influence neuron activity.
Wow, so there's a lot more going on in the brain than we used to think.
Definitely.
Okay, so we've got our neurons and our glia, but how do they actually communicate?
That's where neurotransmitters come in. They're the messages zipping between neurons.
The chemical messengers.
Exactly. And there's also neuroendocrinology.
Remember what now?
Neuroendocrinology. It's basically how the brain's communication system interacts with the endocrine system, which produces hormones.
Okay, so this is where our mental state and our physical health start to intersect, like how stress can lead to physical symptoms.
Precisely. And one hormone that plays a big role in all this is cortisol, often called the stress hormone.
So when we're stressed, our brain triggers the release of cortisol.
That's right. And chronic stress can lead to chronically high cortisol, which can wreak havoc on the body and the brain.
So that's how stress can contribute to things like anxiety and depression.
It's a big part of the picture, yeah. And it all ties back to the HPA axis.
MPA axis, that's the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenal glands, right?
Yes. They all work together to regulate that stress response.
This is all so interconnected. It's like, to really understand mental health, we need to see how all these systems interact.
Exactly. And that's why this neuroscience foundation is so important.
It's like you're giving me a whole new lens to view mental health through.
And with this lens, we can start to explore specific psychological disorders in more depth.
Okay, I'm ready. Let's start with one of the most complex, schizophrenia.
Schizophrenia, a disorder that's often misunderstood.
So what's actually happening in the brain when someone's experiencing psychosis?
Well, it's like a puzzle with many pieces, and we don't have all the answers yet.
But there are some key theories, right?
Right. One is the dopamine hypothesis, which suggests that an overactivity of dopamine in certain brain circuits can contribute to psychosis.
So too much dopamine leads to hallucinations and delusions?
Yeah.
But I've also heard that it's not that simple.
You're right. There's also the glutamate hypothesis, focusing on the role of glutamate, another neurotransmitter. It suggests that abnormalities in the glutamate system, like a deficiency in NMDA receptor activity, might be involved.
Okay, so it's not just dopamine going haywire. There's more to the story.
Exactly. And then there's the neurodevelopmental theory, which proposes that disruptions in brain development early in life can set the stage for schizophrenia.
So it could start even before birth.
Potentially, yes. It's likely a combination of genetic predisposition and environmental factors.
A lot to consider.
It is, and it's important to remember that these are just theories.
But they give us a framework for understanding what might be going on in the brain.
Right. And on top of those theories, we also see actual changes in the brain in people with schizophrenia.
What kind of changes?
Well, studies have shown structural and functional changes in areas like the prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, and amygdala.
Those areas we were just talking about. The ones involved in thinking, memory, and emotion regulation, all affected in schizophrenia.
Exactly. It's all connected.
So as mental health nurses, we can use this knowledge to better understand our patients' experiences.
Absolutely.
What about genetics? How much of a role does that play in schizophrenia?
It has a strong genetic component, but it's not a simple one gene, one disorder situation.
So it's more complicated than that.
Much more. It's likely many genes interacting with each other and with environmental factors.
So it's nature and nurture working together.
Oh,
This is really giving me a much deeper understanding of schizophrenia. Okay, so what's next on our brain tour?
let's delve into another major player, depression.
I know depression is more than just feeling sad. What's happening on a biological level when someone's depressed?
There are several theories, but one of the most prominent is the monoamine hypothesis. It suggests that a deficiency in certain neurotransmitters, like serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine, contributes to depression.
Wait, those are the same neurotransmitters involved in mood and reward that we talked about earlier?
You got it. But again, it's not that simple. The HPA axis, that stress response system we discussed, also plays a big role in depression.
So it's not just a chemical imbalance.
Right. It's more complex than that.
What does the HPA axis have to do with depression?
Well, it can become overactive in people with depression, leading to chronically high levels of cortisol.
And that constant cortisol can lead to those feelings of fatigue, low mood, and difficulty concentrating.
Exactly.
And on top of that, there's also evidence that inflammation might be involved in depression.
That's right. It's a relatively new area of research, but it's looking more and more like inflammation might disrupt brain function and contribute to depression.
So it's not just one thing, it's a whole web of factors. Neurotransmitters, hormones, inflammation.
Wow. And as a mental health nurse, you're going to see how these biological factors manifest in your patient's experiences.
This is so helpful. Are there also visible changes in the brain in people with depression? like we saw with schizophrenia?
Yes, definitely. Studies have shown changes in areas like the hippocampus, amygdala, and prefrontal cortex.
So those same key players are involved again?
It seems like they're involved in a lot.
So the hippocampus, that memory center, can actually shrink in depression.
That's right. And that might explain the memory problems some people with depression experience.
And what about the amygdala and prefrontal cortex?
Well, the amygdala, our fear center, can become overactive, making people more sensitive to negative emotions. And the prefrontal cortex, that decision-making center, can show decreased activity.
Wow, so we can actually see the biological roots of depression in the brain.
Pretty amazing. Right.
It is. This is giving you a whole new perspective. Okay, so we've tackled schizophrenia and depression. What's next on our list of disorders?
Let's move on to anxiety disorders.
Anxiety, another huge category.
It is. But before we get into specifics, it's important to remember that anxiety exists on a spectrum. We have specific phobias, social anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, PTSD. They all share that common thread of fear and worry that's out of proportion to the actual threat.
So whether it's a fear of spiders or crippling social anxiety, there are common brain mechanisms at play.
Exactly.
And those fear circuits, the ones involving the amygdala, can become overly sensitive in people with anxiety disorders,
Right. It's like the brain's alarm system is malfunctioning.
sending out false alarms.
Exactly.
And the sources also talk about the role of learning, like faulty fear conditioning.
Right. Like if someone has a traumatic car accident, their brain might learn to associate cars with danger and develop a phobia of driving.
So the brain is trying to protect us, but sometimes it overgeneralizes.
Exactly. And that understanding of fear conditioning is crucial for developing effective treatments like exposure therapy.
Okay, so we've got this basic understanding of how anxiety works in the brain. But are there any differences depending on the type of anxiety disorder?
That's a great question, and one that researchers are still working to fully understand. But we do know that different anxiety disorders might involve different patterns of brain activity.
Interesting. So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Definitely not. We're still unraveling the complexities of anxiety.
Well, this has definitely given me a much deeper understanding. Okay, so we've covered schizophrenia, depression, anxiety. What's next on our journey through the world of psychological disorders?
Let's move on to personality disorders, conditions that involve enduring patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that differ significantly from what's considered typical.
So it's not just about having a quirky personality. These patterns actually cause problems in people's lives.
Exactly. And the sources talk about 10 distinct personality disorders.
10. Wow, that's a lot.
It is, but remember, these disorders exist on a spectrum. Someone might have some traits without meeting all the criteria for a diagnosis.
That makes sense. We all have our quirks. It's when those quirks become inflexible and cause problems that we start talking about personality disorders.
Exactly. And to make things a bit easier, the DSM groups these 10 disorders into 3 main clusters.
Okay, so tell me about these clusters.
Well, cluster A includes the paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorders.
Those are the ones with odd or eccentric thinking and behavior, right?
Exactly. They might be suspicious of others, withdrawn from social interactions, or have unusual beliefs.
What about cluster B?
Cluster B is all about dramatic, emotional, or erratic behavior.
So that includes antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic personality disorders.
You got it. Think risky behavior, intense relationships, a need for attention.
And finally, cluster C.
Cluster C is characterized by anxious and fearful behavior. The avoidant, dependent, and obsessive-compulsive personality disorders fall into this category.
So these are folks who might be excessively shy, need to be taken care of, or be really preoccupied with orderliness and control.
Right. And of course, these are just categories.
And people don't always fit neatly into boxes.
Exactly. Someone might have traits from different clusters.
I can imagine diagnosing and treating personality disorders can be challenging.
It definitely can be. The source material actually mentions some of the limitations of this categorical approach.
Limitations?
Yeah, some researchers are proposing a dimensional model of personality instead.
When's that?
It suggests that it's more helpful to think of personality traits as existing along a continuum rather than in separate categories.
So instead of saying someone has borderline personality disorder, we might describe them as having high levels of impulsivity, emotional instability, and difficulty with relationships.
Exactly. It's a more nuanced and flexible way of thinking about personality.
That makes sense. So as mental health nurses, we need to consider the whole picture, not just the diagnosis.
Absolutely. The individual, their experiences, their strengths, their challenges, it's all part of providing effective care.
This is giving me a lot to think about as I work with patients. What's next on our list?
Let's talk about eating disorders, specifically anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa.
Those are serious conditions. Anorexia is about restricting food intake, and bulimia involves cycles of binge eating and purging.
Got it.
Uh,
And both often involve a distorted body image, a fear of gaining weight, and a preoccupation with food and weight.
I can only imagine how challenging it must be to treat those conditions.
It is challenging. The sources emphasize that eating disorders are complex, with biological, psychological, and sociocultural factors all playing a role.
So it's not just about vanity or a desire to be thin.
Definitely not. It's much deeper than that.
What do the sources say about the biological side of things?
Well, research suggests that neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, and opioids might be involved.
So again, it's not just one neurotransmitter going haywire. It's more complex.
Exactly. And one interesting area of research is the brain's reward system. It seems that in eating disorders, this system, which is normally activated by things like eating, might be altered.
So for someone with anorexia, restricting food might actually trigger a reward response.
That's what some researchers believe.
That's incredible. So it's not just a matter of willpower or making better choices. There's a strong biological component.
Right, and understanding that is so important for providing compassionate and effective care.
Okay, so we've covered personality disorders and eating disorders. What's next?
Let's talk about substance use disorders.
Substance use disorders, those are conditions where people continue to use a substance despite negative consequences.
Right, it's not just about liking a substance, it's about continuing to use it even when it causes problems.
And there are so many substances that can be misused.
Absolutely. Alcohol, stimulants, opioids, cannabis, you name it. Any substance that affects mood, thinking, or behavior has the potential for misuse.
So what's going on in the brain when someone develops a substance use disorder?
The brain's reward system is at the heart of it. When we do pleasurable things, our brain releases dopamine, that feel-good chemical. Well, drugs hijack this system.
Hijack.
Yeah, they flood the brain with dopamine, creating an artificially intense pleasure. And over time, the brain gets used to this dopamine surge and becomes less sensitive.
So the person needs to use more of the drug to get the same effect.
Exactly. That's how tolerance develops. And as tolerance increases, the person can become physically dependent, meaning they'll experience withdrawal symptoms when they stop using.
And those withdrawal symptoms can be pretty awful.
They can be. So it becomes a vicious cycle, needing more of the drug to feel good and fearing the withdrawal symptoms if you stop.
It sounds incredibly difficult to break free from.
It is. And it's important to remember that it's not just about the reward system. Other areas of the brain are involved too, like the amygdala, which contributes to the anxiety and dread of withdrawal.
So addiction is truly a brain disease. This is really helping me understand addiction in a new light. Okay, what else do we need to cover?
Let's talk about ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder.
ADHD, that's the one with inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity, right? I hear some people say kids will grow out of it.
It's a common misconception. ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder. It involves disruptions in brain development that can cause lifelong challenges.
So which parts of the brain are we talking about here?
Well, research points to the prefrontal cortex, the basal ganglia, and the cerebellum.
The prefrontal cortex, that's our executive control center, right? So if it's not functioning properly, that could explain the problems with attention and impulsivity we see in ADHD.
Exactly.
And what about the basal ganglia? What does that do?
The basal ganglia is involved in regulating movement and motivation. It's thought to be involved in the hyperactivity we often see in ADHD.
And the cerebellum. That's the one for coordination. What's its role in ADHD?
Well, it's involved in more than just physical coordination. The cerebellum also contributes to things like attention and timing, which can be affected in ADHD.
So it's like multiple parts of the brain are working together or not working together to create this complex picture of ADHD.
Exactly.
Are there specific neurotransmitters involved?
Yes. Research suggests that dopamine and norepinephrine play a role in ADHD. It's thought there might be a dysregulation in those pathways.
Hey, those are the same neurotransmitters we talked about with substance use disorders, right? The ones involved in the reward system.
You're right. They are.
So it's like different disorders can share these common neurobiological threads.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that makes understanding the brain so fascinating.
This is really eye-opening. It's giving me a much deeper appreciation for the complexities of ADHD. Okay, what's next?
Let's explore autism spectrum disorder, or ASD.
ASD. I know it's characterized by difficulties with social communication and interaction, repetitive behaviors, and often sensory sensitivities.
That's right. And it's called a spectrum for a reason. Individuals with ASD can vary widely in their symptoms and abilities.
Some individuals with ASD might be nonverbal, while others are very verbal. Some might need a lot of support, while others live independently. It's a really diverse group.
Exactly. And that variability makes ASD both fascinating and challenging.
So what's happening in the brain in ASD?
Well, research suggests that there are disruptions in brain development, especially in areas involved in social communication, language, and sensory processing.
So areas like the prefrontal cortex, temporal lobe, and parietal lobe might be affected.
Right.
And are there any specific neurotransmitters involved?
Research suggests possible roles for serotonin, dopamine, and GABA, but like many of the disorders we've discussed, it's likely a complex interplay of factors.
It sounds like with ASD, we're still trying to put all the pieces together.
We are, but the research is advancing all the time, and we're learning more about how these brain regions and neurotransmitters interact to create the diverse picture of ASD.
What about genetics? Does that play a role?
Yes, it's thought that multiple genes likely interact with environmental factors to influence a person's susceptibility to ASD.
Nature and nurture, once again.
It always comes back to that, doesn't it?
This information is so valuable for understanding ASD and supporting individuals and families who are affected by it.
I agree. Knowledge is power, and it can help break down stereotypes and promote a more compassionate approach.
Okay, I'm ready to tackle our next disorder. What's up next?
Let's talk about sleep disorders.
Sleep disorders. I know those involve disruptions in sleep patterns, and I'm guessing they're much more common than we realize.
You're right, they are very common. The sources talk about a wide range of them: insomnia, narcolepsy, sleep apnea, restless leg syndrome.
So insomnia is difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep. Narcolepsy is excessive daytime sleepiness. Sleep apnea is pauses in breathing during sleep. And restless leg syndrome is that urge to move your legs.
You've got it.
What's going on in the brain when someone has a sleep disorder?
Well, it looks like sleep disorders often involve disruptions in the brain's sleep-wake cycle. This cycle is regulated by neurotransmitters, hormones, and environmental cues.
So it's not just about bad sleep hygiene. There's a biological component too.
Absolutely. While lifestyle factors can contribute, there can be underlying biological mechanisms at play as well.
Can you give me an example?
Sure, in insomnia, there might be an overactivity of the brain's arousal system.
So the brain is just too wired to fall asleep.
Essentially, yes. And in narcolepsy, it's thought that there's a deficiency in a neurotransmitter called hypocretin, which helps regulate wakefulness.
Without enough hypocretin, it's hard to stay awake.
Exactly.
This is fascinating. I'm starting to see sleep disorders in a whole new light. It's not just about being tired. It's about brain chemistry and biological processes.
Right. And understanding those underlying mechanisms is essential for providing effective treatment.
This whole deep dive has been so eye-opening. I feel like I'm looking at mental health with a whole new set of eyes.
That's great to hear. We've covered a lot of ground today, but there's still so much to explore.
I know. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
And as we move forward, we'll delve deeper into the treatments for these disorders and how understanding the brain can guide your approach to patient care.
I can't wait.
Now that we've toured the brain hospital, let's head over to the pharmacy and talk about the medications used to treat these mental health conditions, the ones you'll be administering and explaining to your patients.
Ah, yes, pharmacology. To be honest, it's always felt a bit like a mystery to me. I know these medications can make a huge difference, but I've always wondered how they actually work, on a molecular level.
It is pretty amazing when you think about it. Tiny pills, big impact. Let's start with antidepressants, specifically the most common type, SSRIs.
SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Those are often the first choice for treating depression, right?
They are. But how do they work? Remember those neurotransmitters we talked about?
The chemical messengers in the brain.
Right. Well, serotonin is one of those key messengers. It plays a role in mood, sleep, appetite, a lot of things.
And the theory is that in depression, there's not enough serotonin signaling, right?
That's one way to think about it. So normally, after serotonin is released into the synapse, that gap between neurons, it gets reabsorbed back into the sending neuron, kind of like a courier delivering a package and then immediately picking it back up.
Okay, I'm following. So SSRIs come in and block that reabsorption process.
Exactly. They prevent that reuptake, so more serotonin hangs out in the synapse, and it's available to bind to receptors on the receiving neuron. It's like making sure that package actually gets delivered and read.
So SSRIs aren't creating more serotonin, they're just making better use of what's
Mhm.
already there.
Exactly. And this increased serotonin activity is what helps boost mood. But of course, there are other types of antidepressants too, like SNRIs.
It's NRIs. What are those?
SNRIs stand for serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. They block the reuptake of both serotonin and norepinephrine.
Norepinephrine, that's another neurotransmitter. Isn't that involved in the fight or flight response?
You got it. So SNRIs might be a good option for patients who have fatigue or low energy along with their depression, since norepinephrine can boost alertness and motivation.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got SSRIs, SNRIs, any other antidepressants we should know about?
There are also tricyclic antidepressants, or TCAs. They're older medications and work a bit more broadly, affecting multiple neurotransmitter systems.
So they might be an option if SSRIs or SNRIs haven't worked?
That's one scenario where they might be considered, but they tend to have more side effects, so they're not usually the first choice.
Got it. So it's like choosing the right tool for the job. Each antidepressant has its own pros and cons.
Exactly. And that's where your knowledge as a mental health nurse is so valuable. You're working closely with prescribers and patients, monitoring for effectiveness and side effects, advocating for adjustments to the treatment plan as needed.
This is really helpful. I'm starting to feel more comfortable understanding and explaining these meds to my patients. Okay, what about antipsychotics? Those are used to treat psychosis, right?
Right. Conditions like schizophrenia, where people experience hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking. Antipsychotics are often a key part of treatment.
And they work by blocking dopamine receptors, right? We talked about the dopamine hypothesis in schizophrenia earlier.
You're right. Blocking those dopamine receptors can help reduce psychotic symptoms. But there are two main types of antipsychotics, typical and atypical.
Okay, what's the difference?
Typical antipsychotics, sometimes called first generation, mainly focus on blocking dopamine receptors, specifically the D2 subtype. Atypical antipsychotics, or second generation, also block dopamine, but they tend to affect other neurotransmitter systems too, like serotonin.
So the atypical ones are maybe a bit more targeted, which could mean fewer side effects.
That's the general idea. But remember, every medication, including antipsychotics, has potential side effects. It's a balancing act, weighing the potential benefits against the risks for each patient.
This is making a lot more sense now.
Yeah.
Okay, what about anxiety medications? I know those are really common.
You're talking about anxiolytics. And yes, they're widely used, especially benzodiazepines.
Benzodiazepines, I've heard of those. How do they work?
They enhance the effects of GABA, a neurotransmitter that inhibits brain activity. It's like the brain's chill pill.
So they basically calm down those overactive anxiety circuits.
Exactly. They promote relaxation and can even help with sleep. But here's the thing. Benzodiazepines can be habit-forming.
So they're not a long-term solution.
They can be helpful for short-term relief, but long-term use is usually avoided because of the risk of dependence and other potential side effects like drowsiness or dizziness.
Makes sense. Are there any other options for anxiety that are safer in the long run?
Yes. Actually, some antidepressants, the ones we talked about earlier, can also help with anxiety.
So the lines between medication categories can be a little blurry.
Sometimes, yes, it all depends on the individual and what they need.
This is really helpful for seeing the big picture. Okay, last stop on our medication tour. What about mood stabilizers?
Mood stabilizers, those are the go-to meds for bipolar disorder.
Bipolar disorder, the one with extreme mood swings, mania and depression.
Right. And mood stabilizers like lithium can help even out those swings.
Lithium. That's interesting. I know it's a naturally occurring element. How does it work in the brain?
That's a great question. And to be honest, we don't have all the answers yet. It seems to affect a lot of things, different neurotransmitters, even those second messenger systems inside cells.
Second messenger systems. Those sound complicated.
Think of them like internal communication networks within the cell. They relay signals from neurotransmitters. Lithium seems to tweak those signals in a way that helps stabilize mood.
So lithium is a bit of a multitasker.
It seems that way, and there are other medications, like some anticonvulsants, that can also act as mood stabilizers.
Anticonvulsants aren't those for seizures.
They are. But some of them also have mood-stabilizing effects. It's kind of like how some antidepressants can help with anxiety. Sometimes a medication that's used for one thing can be effective for something else, too.
The brain is so complex. It's like all these medications are playing a game of dominoes,
Hmm.
affecting different systems and creating this ripple effect.
I like that analogy. And it highlights why understanding how these medications work is so important. It helps us make good decisions about treatment, anticipate side effects, and ultimately provide the best possible care.
This whole conversation about pharmacology has been incredibly insightful.
Hmm.
I feel much more confident in my understanding now. Okay, so we've covered medications. What about the other big piece of the puzzle, psychotherapy?
Psychotherapy is sometimes called the talking cure.
I know there are so many different types of therapy out there. Cognitive behavioral therapy, psychodynamic therapy, interpersonal therapy, it can be overwhelming.
It's a whole other world. But what all those therapies have in common is using dialogue, exploration, and the therapeutic relationship to help people understand and manage their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
And as we talked about earlier, psychotherapy isn't just about talking. It can actually change the brain.
That's right. Brain imaging studies show that therapy can lead to actual changes in brain activity and structure.
It's like rewiring the brain.
Exactly. And different types of therapy might target different brain regions or networks. For example, cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, often focuses on challenging negative thoughts and building coping skills.
So CBT might strengthen the prefrontal cortex, that decision-making part of the brain, helping people gain more control.
That's one way to think about it. And psychodynamic therapy, which explores unconscious conflicts and past experiences, might help reduce activity in the amygdala, calming down that fear center.
It's amazing how these different therapies can work on the brain in such specific ways.
It is. And it highlights why understanding neurobiology is so crucial. It helps us see how medication and therapy can work together to bring about positive change.
This is really expanding my view of psychotherapy. It's not just talk. It's a powerful tool for changing the brain and improving mental well-being.
Exactly. And as we continue, we'll explore how this understanding of the brain can inform your approach to patient care, helping you make informed decisions and provide truly holistic support.
Wow, we've really been through a lot in this deep dive,
Yeah.
from the anatomy of the brain to all those psychological disorders and then all those medications and therapies. It's a lot to take in.
It is, but you're doing great.
I feel like my mental health nursing knowledge has gotten a serious upgrade.
You've definitely added some powerful tools to your toolkit.
Definitely. But before we wrap things up, I want to touch on something that's been coming up throughout our whole conversation.
What's that?
The idea of holistic care in mental health.
Oh, absolutely. That's so important.
It's like, as mental health nurses, we're not just dealing with brains. We're caring for whole people. So it's not just about finding the right med or the right therapy technique. It's about seeing the person behind the diagnosis, right?
Absolutely. It's about understanding their experiences, their relationships, their cultural background, their socioeconomic situation. All those things contribute to their mental health.
You said it earlier, we're not just treating brains, we're caring for people.
Yeah.
And that care goes beyond just addressing symptoms.
Right. It's about supporting them in their journey of recovery.
Recovery, that's a word we hear all the time in mental health. But what does it actually mean?
Well, it's more than just getting rid of symptoms. It's about living a meaningful life, even with mental health challenges.
So it's about hope, resilience, growth.
Exactly. And that focus on recovery really emphasizes how important that holistic approach is.
It sounds like mental health nurses are in a unique position to help facilitate that kind of holistic recovery.
You are. You spend so much time with patients observing, listening, advocating. You see the whole picture, not just a diagnosis on a chart.
This deep dive has really shown me how interconnected everything is. The biology, the psychology, the social context. It's like we're all part of this big web.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And as you continue your journey as a mental health nurse, remember to hold on to that perspective.
I will. This has been an incredible learning experience. I feel so much more prepared to approach my patients with empathy, understanding, and a much deeper knowledge of what they're going through.
That's wonderful to hear. And remember, this is just the beginning. Keep learning, stay curious, and never underestimate the power of human connection.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. This has been amazing. And to our listener, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of mental health. We hope you learned a lot, and we encourage you to keep exploring, keep learning, and keep making a difference.